Every night my daughter would go into my wife's room. One day I installed a camera to make sure my wife was still safe. But when I opened the footage and saw the truth, I was so shocked I couldn't breathe. There was no blood, no sound. The video played in silence, and in that silence, I felt that my family was no longer a family. Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and whether you've ever questioned the silence in your own home. Don't forget to like and subscribe. This is a fictional story with added details for deeper, meaningful, and enriching experience. They say a building is only as strong as its foundation, but standing 50 stories above Minneapolis, I realized I'd spent 30 years building steel monuments, while my own home was rotting from the inside out. My name is Thane Garrison, a 55-year-old senior project manager who spent 30 years building the skyline of Minneapolis, never suspecting that the most dangerous structural failure was happening inside my own home. My life has been measured in blueprints, load-bearing capacities, and the cold, unyielding precision of architectural-grade steel. My professional portfolio is worth $28 million, a figure built on the fact that I never missed a measurement and never tolerated a flaw. But as I leaned against the glass of the observation deck, the cold wind at 50 stories whistling through the seams of the newly installed panels, I felt a tremor that had nothing to do with the wind load. For over a decade, I have been a ghost in my own life, a man who knows the thread counts of the Ritz-Carlton sheets better than the pattern of his own bedspread. I have spent more time in hotel rooms than in my own bed, sacrificing the warmth of a dinner table for the sterile efficiency of a construction site office. I convinced myself that the $28 million was a shield, a structural reinforcement for the family I left behind in Edina. I told myself that my wife Alara understood the cost of the Garrison legacy, and that my daughter Leonie was proud of the towers her father raised. I believed that as long as the money kept flowing and the foundations remained level, the inhabitants of my life were safe and satisfied. I was a master builder after all. I knew how to manage stress, how to compensate for shifting soil, and how to ensure that everything stayed upright. Have you ever looked at a finished structure and wondered which brick would be the first to fail? I should have asked that about my own daughter. Looking out over the city, the smell of ozone and wet concrete from a nearby pouring site filled my lungs, a scent that usually brought me a sense of peace. Now it just felt heavy. I checked the gold watch on my wrist, a heavy $26,000 weight that felt like a shackle today. I was wrapping up a grueling 3-week stint on a Denver skyscraper project, my mind already drifting toward the flight home. Tomorrow was my 26th anniversary with Alara, 26 years of her being my anchor while I sailed into every storm that promised a higher profit margin. She deserved more than just roses this time. She deserved the man she married, not the project manager who merely visited her between deadlines. I had bought a luxury sapphire necklace in Denver, a piece of jewelry that cost more than most people's homes, convinced that this shimmering blue stone would somehow make up for the thousands of hours I'd been absent. I checked my phone for the third time in an hour. Lainey had sent a short text earlier saying everything was fine at home, but her voice had sounded different on our last call. There was a brittleness to her tone, a lack of the usual warmth that I'd attributed to her just being busy. I pushed the doubt aside, trusting in the stability of the house I'd built. Then the phone buzzed. A ghost in my pocket. It was a notification for a missed call and a voicemail from Alara's phone recorded at 3 in the morning the previous night. My thumb hovered over the screen, the static hiss of a low-quality recording already playing in my mind before I even hit the button. I hadn't heard the phone ring in my hotel room. When the message started, there was no greeting, no anniversary wish, just a hollow silence followed by the sound of muffled, desperate crying. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like a pile driver on a hollow site. Behind the sobbing, there was a voice, a low, flat stranger's voice that didn't belong in my house while I was gone. It was barely a whisper, a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. I played the message again, straining to hear the voice in the background, a voice that didn't belong in my house while I was gone. The wheels of the Gulf Stream slammed onto the tarmac with a violence that matched the storm in my chest, every second of the taxi to the terminal feeling like an hour stolen from Alara's life. I didn't wait for the stairs to fully settle before I was out of the cabin, the crisp Minnesota air biting at my lungs. Jerry, my driver, was standing by the black SUV, but I didn't give him a chance to open the door. "I don't have time for the scenic route, Jerry. Give me the keys," I said, my voice like a serrated blade. He didn't argue. He saw the fire in my eyes and handed over the fob. I threw myself into the driver's seat, and the tires shrieked as I peeled away from the private hangar, leaving a cloud of white smoke in the moonlight. 30 miles to the front door. "Just hold on, Alara." I merged onto Highway 62, weaving through the late evening traffic with a reckless precision I usually reserved for high-stakes site inspections. The 3 a.m. voicemail looped in my head, a haunting soundtrack of muffled sobs and that low, flat stranger's voice. I ran through the logistics of my home security as the mile markers blurred past. I had spent a fortune on motion sensors and reinforced glass, but I realized with a sickening jolt that I'd left too much trust in the hands of others. I had built a fortress, but I was beginning to fear I had locked my wife inside it with a ghost. You spend your life building walls to keep the world out, but you never think about what happens when the poison is already inside the room. I turned into the gated community and Adina, the SUV, bumping over the curb as I accelerated toward our property. The long winding driveway was flanked by skeletal trees, their shadows stretching across the light snowfall like reaching fingers. As the house came into view, my heart sank. It was too dark for an anniversary night. Usually Alara had the entire facade illuminated warm gold spilling from every window to welcome me home. Tonight, only a single flickering light in the upstairs hallway offered any sign of life. I slammed the brakes and barely waited for the engine to die before I was at the front door. I reached for my keys, but my hand stopped. The door was unlocked, unheard of for my security-obsessed household. Someone had been in such a hurry to enter or leave they forgot the deadbolt. I pushed it open, dropping my leather bags on the marble floor with a hollow echo. I was immediately hit by a heavy medicinal smell, antiseptic and stale tea that didn't belong in my home. Alara Leone. "I'm home early," I called out, but only the wind whistling through the chimney answered me. "Why is it so cold in here?" I moved toward the living room, my boots clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. My wife, Alara Garrison, 52, sat staring at the garden we had planted together, a ghost of the woman who once commanded every room she entered. She was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair wearing a deep emerald designer gown that hung off her frame as if she had shrunk. Her skin looked gray and translucent, almost papery under the dim, recessed lighting. "Happy anniversary, sweetheart." "I brought the red ones," I whispered, stepping into her line of sight with the bouquet of roses. She flinches away as if I were a stranger, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She didn't look at the flowers. She looked through me. The roses hit the floor. Red petals scattered like blood on the white marble. Who are you?" Leonie said. "No visitors tonight?" She rasped, her voice a fragile shadow of the melodic tone I loved. I reached out, taking her dry, cold hand in mine, desperate for a spark of recognition. As I pulled her sleeve back slightly to find her pulse, I froze. Deep circular bruising was hidden under the silk, looking like someone had held her down with force. The woman who once ran an empire couldn't even recognize her own husband, but the bruises on her wrist told a story that her lips couldn't find the words for. The sharp click-clack of designer heels against the marble foyer cut through the silence like a jackhammer, snapping Alara's head toward the door with a look of terror in her trembling pupils that chilled my marrow. Standing there was Leonie Garrison, my 25-year-old daughter. Her eyes filled with a concern so polished it should have been my first warning sign. She froze for a heartbeat, her hand tightening around a leather folio. "Dad." You weren't supposed to be home until tomorrow," she said, her voice dropping into a register of practiced sorrow. She was across the room in a blur of silk, physically stepping between me and Alara, effectively breaking the contact I was trying to establish. Before I could ask about the bruises I had seen on Alara's wrist, Leonie was already delivering the blow. "It's early onset Thane. Dr. Boyd says it is aggressive. I have been doing everything myself for the last month, so you could focus on the Denver build. I didn't want to break you while you were managing that skyscraper project." I stood there, the anniversary roses still scattered on the floor, like a bloodstain on the white stone, watching my daughter reveal that she had already obtained a temporary power of attorney while I was away. She claimed it was medically necessary for immediate treatments, a legal bypass she had engineered while I was 3 states away, trusting her with my life's anchor. I watched her movements, noting how she treated Alara like a broken piece of furniture. Rather than a mother, her touch efficient, but devoid of the warmth a child should show a parent in decline. Have you ever seen a structure that looks perfect on the outside, but your gut tells you the load-bearing walls are made of cardboard? That was my daughter's voice. She produced a thick folder, the crinkle of medical-grade paper filling the room, as she showed me pills and schedules. She dismissed the bruises I saw as simple clumsiness, from a loss of motor control, a side effect of the aggressive decline. I tried to look back at Alara to find the woman who once ran a gallery with an iron will, but Leonie was already guiding her toward the stairs. "Don't push her, Dad. You'll just trigger another episode. She needs to go to bed immediately." Overstimulation at this hour leads to sundowning symptoms. I reached out to touch Alara's shoulder, but she flinched again, her vacant gaze fixed on Leonie, as if she were a prison guard rather than a caretaker. The clinical smell of the new pill bottles on the side table was suffocating, a chemical scent that had completely replaced the lavender perfume Alara had worn for 2 decades. Leonie's efficiency was terrifying. She informed me that she had already moved my things to the guest room, insisting that Alara needed a consistent sleep environment, without the interruption of a partner who had been gone for weeks. I felt the aggressive coldness of the guest room sheets as I finally sat on the edge of the bed later that night, the house around me feeling like a hollowed-out shell. Diagnosis: Alzheimer's. My mind screamed, lie. I have spent my life reading blueprints looking for the one weak point that could bring down $100 million of investment. There was a structural failure in Leonie's story, a hairline crack that she hadn't managed to plaster over. I opened the medical folder she had left on the hallway table, my hands steady even as my heart raced. My eyes locked onto the signature of the prescribing physician. Dr. Kenneth Boyd. It was a name that made the hair on my neck stand up. I remembered him from 5 years ago, a specialist I once blacklisted from a major construction site for forging safety inspections and taking kickbacks from contractors. Leonie's perfect medical report was signed by a man I knew would sell his soul for a decimal point in the right place. And suddenly the bruises on Alara's arm looked like a crime scene. Sleep didn't come to a man who specialized in structural integrity when he suspected his own family's foundation was built on shifting sand and lies. I lay fully clothed on the guest room bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it sliced through the stagnant air in a hypnotic, useless rhythm. My ears were tuned to the internal hum of the Adina estate, every groan of the floorboards and hiss of the air conditioning analyzed with a project manager's precision. I couldn't stop thinking about Boyd. What did you promise her to sign that report? Kenneth, a man like Boyd, didn't just stumble into a family tragedy. He was invited usually by someone with something to hide. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The silence in this house used to be peaceful, a reward for the months spent on loud, chaotic sites. Now it felt like a physical weight, thick and suffocating. As I reached for the door handle to inspect the hallway, my hand brushed against the metal. I froze. The sharp, metallic scent of the hallway smart locks was new. I realized then that Leonie had replaced all the original hardware on Alara's room with smart locks that only she could control via an app on her phone. She hadn't just secured the room. She had partitioned it from me. It was 1:45 a.m. when the first movement broke the stillness. I heard the distinct click of a door and soft, rhythmic footsteps, the kind of practiced creep that suggested this wasn't the first time. I opened the guest room door an inch, the cold floorboards biting against my bare feet. A shadow moved across the blue glow of a distant nightlight. It was Leonie. She didn't turn on the main lights, which was my first red flag. A doting daughter caring for a sick mother in the middle of the night usually needs to see what she is doing. I watched as she slipped into the master bedroom, the door sealing shut behind her, with a soft, electronic beep of the new lock. I started a mental countdown. 1 minute. 5. 10. My mind looped through the possibilities, but none of them sat right. 20 minutes. What could she be doing in there for 20 minutes in total darkness? Move Thane. See for yourself. Do you know what it feels like to realize the person you'd take a bullet for is the one pulling the trigger? I crept down the hall, my heart a dull hammer against my ribs, until I was standing right outside the door that used to lead to my sanctuary. I waited. The silence from behind the door was worse than any noise could have been. Finally, 40 minutes after she entered, the latch clicked. Leonie emerged, nearly jumping out of her skin as she saw me standing in the hallway shadows. Her doting daughter persona vanished instantly, the grief-stricken mask replaced by a sharp, defensive hostility. "What were you doing in there for 40 minutes, Leonie?" I asked, my voice a low, analytical rasp. She didn't even blink. She stepped toward me, her face inches from mine, assisting with an accident Thane. Something you wouldn't know anything about since you were too busy building towers in Denver to care about your wife's dignity. Her eyes, they weren't blue anymore. They were cold, hard steel, reflecting a version of my daughter I didn't recognize. She wasn't finished. Before I could demand to see Alara, she pulled a folded paper from the pocket of her robe, a pre-signed medical directive. This states that your presence distresses the patient in her current state. She whispered, her voice like sandpaper. If you interfere again, or try to force your way into that room, I have the legal authority to have you removed from this house tonight. I looked at the paper, then at the girl I'd raised, and realized I was standing on a site that had already collapsed. She wasn't just taking care of her mother. She was building a cage, and she just handed me the eviction notice for my own life. I waited until the soft click of Leonie's door signaled she'd finally retired before I crept into the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird as I began to sift through the remains of our family's life in the trash. The silence of the house was absolute, yet it shrieked with the weight of the secrets I was unearthing. I pulled the heavy plastic trash bags from the bin, the rustle echoing in the cavernous room like thunder. My hands, usually steady enough to calibrate a laser level, trembled as I encountered the smell of stale coffee grounds and sour milk. Digging deeper, I found a receipt for a high-end document shredder purchased the very day I left for Denver, a detail that sat in my gut like lead. Leonie was systematically destroying something, records, memories, perhaps evidence. Then, buried beneath a pile of junk mail, I found a crumpled notice from a high-stakes underground casino. It was a collection demand for a $150,000 personal loan. $150,000. My daughter, the girl I had provided everything for, was bleeding money into a void. Beside the notice lay 3 empty glass vials. They weren't the Alzheimer's medication Leonie had shown me. They were a powerful sedative, the cold, sticky residue on the glass clinging to my skin like a curse. This wasn't healthcare. This was a chemical leash. You think you know your own flesh and blood until you find their name on a debt note that costs more than a human life. The realization that my daughter was financing a gambling addiction with her mother's vitality turned my stomach into a knot of cold fury. I sat on the kitchen floor until the first gray streaks of dawn bled through the windows, feeling more like a scavenger than a master builder. By 8 o'clock, I was in the breakfast nook, watching Alara try to eat. The rattle of a silver spoon against a china bowl was the only sound in the room. Her hands, once capable of restoring delicate oil paintings, were now trembling, blue-veined things that couldn't even manage a mouthful of oatmeal. She was falling apart at a rate that defied any natural logic. People don't just disappear while they're still breathing. Leonie, I said, my voice thick with suppressed rage. Leonie didn't even look up from her tablet, her clinical efficiency, as she wiped a spill from Alara's chin, making my skin crawl. It's a degenerative condition, Dad, she replied with that sharp, brittle tone. Maybe if you'd been here you wouldn't be so surprised. She spoke as if Alara were a faulty appliance, an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a woman to be loved. I couldn't stay in that room. I needed to see Alara in the sun, away from the medicinal gloom of the house. I helped her into the garden, her body feeling as light and fragile as balsa wood. We had only taken a few steps across the manicured lawn when her muscles simply gave out. She collapsed against me, a dead weight that I barely managed to catch. Alara wasn't just sick. She was a skyscraper whose support beams were being sawn through in the dark. I lowered her onto a stone bench, looking into her eyes. For a split second, the fog cleared. Thane, she whispered, her voice a ghost of a rasp. Make it stop. Please. The clarity broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. I'm going to fix this, Alara. I promise. As I gathered her into my arms to carry her back inside, my hand brushed against the hem of her designer gown. I felt something small and hard hidden in the stitching. I reached in and pulled out a miniature digital recorder. It had been crushed, the plastic casing splintered, and the internal chips snapped with deliberate force. Alara had tried to record someone, and it had been found and destroyed, leaving her with nothing but the bruises on her soul. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the clinic's glass doors, smoothing out the rage that threatened to crack my professional veneer before I stepped inside to confront the man who had signed my wife's mental death warrant. The antiseptic sting of the clinic air hit me instantly, a sharp chemical contrast to the smell of wood smoke and autumn I'd left outside. I walked across the linoleum, the squeak of my rubber soles echoing like a warning. A cold, efficient receptionist tried to block my path, her eyes fixed on a digital monitor. Mr. Garrison, you can't just walk back there, she said, her voice a flat monotone. The doctor is with a patient. I didn't stop. I'm not here for an appointment. I'm here for the truth. Get Boyd out here, I replied, leaning over her desk just enough to let her see the authority I'd honed on 40 construction sites. I reminded her that I was the primary health insurance holder and the legal spouse. I scanned the layout while she scrambled to make a call. The place didn't feel like a neurological center. It felt like a private clubhouse, hushed and over-decorated, designed to keep the outside world at a comfortable distance. Within minutes, the man himself appeared. Dr. Kenneth Boyd, a 63-year-old neurologist, with a smile that never reached his predatory eyes, stood behind a mahogany desk that cost more than a nurse's yearly salary when we eventually settled into his private office. He projected an air of manufactured empathy that I found revolting. He began recycling the same Alzheimer's script I'd heard from Leonie, citing atypical rapid onset and high-stress triggers. I sat there, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide the tension. How much does it cost to buy a doctor's signature? In Minneapolis, apparently, it was a piece of jewelry and my wife's sanity. I noticed a high-end luxury watch on Boyd's wrist, the exact limited edition model Leonie had bragged about buying for a special client last month. The gold glint of the watch face under the office lights was a beacon of corruption. I pushed him for the digital lab results, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. I build skyscrapers, doctor. I know when a report has been doctored to hide a structural failure. I want the raw data. He didn't flinch, but his eyes shifted to the cold glass of the office window. There's been a server glitch, Thane. It's temporarily locked the records. I'll email them to you later tonight. It was a lie I'd heard 100 times from crooked contractors, and it confirmed everything. I allowed him to escort me toward the exit, playing the part of the frustrated but defeated husband. As I passed a side employee entrance, I spotted a flash of familiar blonde hair. I ducked back into a small alcove, my heart hammering against my ribs. Leonie was walking through that side door, bypassing the waiting room entirely. I watched as she greeted Dr. Boyd in the hallway. Then she touched him. Not a daughter's touch, a lover's. She reached out and adjusted Boyd's collar with a proprietary flick of her fingers, and they shared a look of familiar predatory intimacy that made my skin crawl. It wasn't professional. It was a partnership. Is he gone? Did he buy it? I heard her whisper the hush of their conspiracy carrying clearly in the quiet corridor. Boyd chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. He's suspicious, Leonie. We need to accelerate the timeline. He reached into his lab coat and handed her a fresh batch of unlabeled vials. Here, sweetheart. Keep her steady. My own daughter was standing there receiving a chemical arsenal from a man she was sleeping with to destroy the mother who had given her everything. Seeing my daughter's hand on that man's chest made my stomach turn, but it gave me the one thing I needed: a target for the cameras I was about to install. I sat in the silence of my SUV, the Minneapolis skyline, taunting me with its orderly beauty, while I calculated the cost of turning my own home into a high-stakes interrogation room. The image of Leonie's hand on Dr. Boyd's chest was burned into my retinas like a welding flash, a jagged white scar on my memory that refused to fade. I gripped the steering wheel until the leather groaned, forcing my breathing into the rhythmic, shallow pattern I used when a site inspection went south. My daughter was no longer just a doting caretaker. She was an operative in a coordinated assault on the woman I loved. I needed eyes where I was blind. I needed a recording that couldn't be disputed by a disgraced doctor's forged medical charts. The glare of the late afternoon sun on the windshield blinded me for a second as I pulled out of the clinic parking lot heading south toward Bloomington. I wasn't looking for a retail security solution. I was looking for industrial-grade betrayal. I pulled up to a nondescript storefront, nestled between a specialized plumbing wholesaler and a high-end data recovery firm. The shop had no flashy neon signs, just a small etched plate on the glass. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of solder and static, the low hum of server fans providing a constant white noise soundtrack to the business of secrets. A young clerk with tired eyes looked up from a circuit board. I didn't wait for a greeting. I need 24-hour remote access, encrypted server storage, and no physical lights on the units. I said, my voice cutting through the electronic hum. He paused, recognizing me from a business journal article I'd seen on his counter earlier. Mr. Garrison, right? I saw your latest tower project. I ignored the pleasantry, my focus purely tactical. This isn't for a nursery kid. I'm securing a high-value asset against a persistent threat. He nodded slowly, then dropped a bombshell that nearly knocked me off my foundation. He mentioned that a young woman matching Leonie's description had been in the store 3 weeks ago, asking specifically about the effective range of high-frequency signal jammers. My skin crawled as the implications settled into my bones. Have you ever felt the skin on your neck crawl when you realize the predator you're hunting has already been hunting you? Leonie hadn't just been planning a poisoning. She had been researching how to blind me before I even knew there was a fight. I meticulously selected my arsenal 4K micro cameras, disguised as smoke detectors, a phone charger for the kitchen, and a nondescript digital alarm clock for Ilara's nightstand that looked identical to the one she'd owned for years. The cold plastic of the micro camera lenses felt like ice in my hand. I paid in cash, pulling the bills from a private reserve I kept for site emergencies, ensuring no digital paper trail would ever alert the family accountants or the daughter who watched them like a hawk. My phone vibrated against my sweaty palm, the screen flashing Leonie's name. I took a breath, letting the project manager persona slide over my rage like a protective shroud. Hey, sweetheart, I said, my voice steady enough to fool a lie detector. I'm just tied up reviewing site permits for the new phase. I'll be back for dinner. Her reply was saccharine, but I could hear the new edge of confidence beneath the warmth. Mom is resting, Dad. She's so much better when it's just the two of us. Don't rush back. The black bag of cameras on the passenger seat felt heavier than 100 tons of structural steel. It was a weight of proof, a burden of truth. I wasn't sure I was ready to carry, but I had no choice left. As I walked back to the SUV, I opened the demo app on my phone to test the receiver sync. A notification popped up immediately, showing an active unauthorized Bluetooth signal broadcasting from the undercarriage of my own vehicle. My heart stopped. It was a localized tracker, a small magnetic leech fed by my own car's battery. My daughter hadn't just occupied the house. She'd turned my own tools against me, and now I had to figure out how to install my eyes without her seeing the blink. I didn't head straight for the driveway. Instead, I pulled into a muddy construction site 2 miles away, crawling under my own SUV with a flashlight between my teeth to rip out the digital parasite my daughter had used to tether me to her lies. The metallic tang of the flashlight casing was bitter against my tongue, a reminder of the foul game I was now forced to play. I felt the grit of mud and road salt on the undercarriage as I located the small magnetic leech near the rear axle. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained the steady tools of an engineer. I didn't just smash it. I saw a long-haul delivery truck idling near the site entrance, and with a calculated flick of the wrist, I attached the tracker to its chassis. Follow that truck to St. Paul, Leonie. I'm going off the grid. I had exactly 30 minutes before their specialist session with Alara was scheduled to end a window narrower than the tolerances on a high-speed rail line. I drove a secondary route avoiding every main thoroughfare and parked my SUV 3 blocks away under the cover of a weeping willow. I entered the estate through the wooded perimeter, where I'd played as a child, the familiar scent of damp pine needles doing nothing to soothe the adrenaline flooding my system. I slipped through the basement utility door, moving with the silence of a man who knew every joist and beam of the house he'd paid for. I ascended the stairs, my ears straining for the slightest sound. I realized immediately that the atmosphere in the master bedroom had changed. Leonie hadn't just been asking about signal jammers. She had already installed a professional-grade white noise generator. The high-pitched whine was subtle, a steady hiss that was designed to mask any sounds of struggle or loud, desperate conversation. It made the air feel thick, pressurized. Click. The house felt like it was breathing with me. Or maybe it was just the vents. I didn't have time to dwell on the violation. I moved to the kitchen, installing a micro camera inside a hollowed-out ventilation grate that gave me a perfect view of the breakfast nook. Then I hurried back to the master suite. The smell of cedar oil Alara loved was still there, but it felt tainted now. Forgive me, Alara. I have to be your eyes because they've stolen your own. My hands were trembling as I opened the casing of the high-end designer clock on her nightstand, fitting the 4K lens into a gap no larger than a pinhead. Focus on the connection. Syncing. 10%, 50, done. My engineering mind fought against the visceral disgust of spying on my own wife's most vulnerable moments, but the alternative was leaving her to drown in the dark. I was the architect of this house, but today, I was its ghost, haunting the halls I'd paid for with 30 years of sweat. I made one final sweep of the nightstand, checking for anything Leonie might have missed. My fingers brushed against a hidden latch I'd built into the back of the drawer years ago, a place Alara kept her private journals. I slid it open expecting a diary, but my breath hitched in my throat. I found a stack of pre-filled death certificate drafts. Everything was there. Her name, her date of birth, the cause of death listed as cardiac arrest, secondary to neurodegenerative complications. Everything was filled out in black ink, except for the final date of passing. My own daughter had already planned the funeral while the body was still warm. The gravel crunched in the driveway. Leonie was home early, and I was still standing in the middle of the master bedroom with a handful of my wife's death warrants. I shoved the death warrants into the small of my back under my belt just as the master bedroom door swung open with a predatory creak that signaled the end of my invisibility. The sharp crinkle of the warrants against my skin felt like a live wire, but I didn't have time to flinch. I scrambled away from the nightstand, snatching a hand towel from the ensuite rack as I turned to face the room. Leonie stood in the doorway, her frame backlit by the hall lights, her eyes narrowing as they swept over the furniture I had just violated. "I'm leaving now, Leonie. The Denver Foundation is cracking. I don't have time for a debrief," I said, my voice projecting the high-pressure, authoritative snap I usually reserved for stalling subcontractors on a failing job site. My heart was a drum against my ribs, but I kept my breathing level. "You look flushed, Dad. Are you sure you're feeling all right to fly?" she asked, her tone dripping with a concern that I now recognized as a diagnostic probe. I brushed past her, the smell of her expensive floral perfume cloying in the small space. "I'm fine. I just need to get this build back on schedule." I made a show of checking a fake notification on my phone, muttering about site permits, to keep her eyes off the newly installed camera hidden in the clock. I realized then that I wasn't just leaving for a business trip. I was leaving a battlefield. Leonie had already mentioned a specialized private estate cleaning service arriving the day after tomorrow. A crew I knew from my work was usually booked to scrub a home after a resident passed away. The blueprint was finished. She was just waiting for the concrete to set. The next morning, the performance reached its final act on the front porch. I stood in the doorway, putting on the mask of a doting father and a weary husband for the benefit of whatever trackers Leonie still had active. I bent down to kiss Alara goodbye, feeling the unnatural coldness of her skin and the frantic, shallow pulse in her wrist. She looked through me, her eyes clouded by whatever chemical leash Leonie was tightening. I reached into my pocket and handed Leonie a large roll of cash, a heavy stack intended for emergency medical expenses. I watched her fingers twitch with a greed she couldn't quite suppress as she tucked the money away. "Take care of her, Leonie. She's everything to me," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Don't worry about a thing, Dad. Everything is under control," she replied, smiling with a warmth that chilled my spine. Have you ever looked into the eyes of your own child and realized you were looking at a stranger with a blueprint for your destruction? I walked to my SUV without looking back, knowing that if my cameras failed, I might never see Alara breathe again. I drove to the airport in a fugue state, the weight of the death warrant still pressed against my spine. I didn't stop until I was strapped into the leather seat of my private jet. The hangar door closed. The world I knew stayed outside. As the engines began their low-frequency vibration and the plane reached cruising altitude, I pulled my smartphone from my jacket. My hands were finally shaking as I opened the encrypted app. The 4K feed was crystal clear, a window into the Adina estate that Leonie didn't know existed. The master bedroom was empty, the white noise generator probably still hissing in the silence. I switched the view to the kitchen and felt the air leave my lungs. Leonie wasn't caring for her mother. She was in the kitchen, her movements fluid and buoyant as she danced to a rhythm only she could hear. She reached into the wine cellar and pulled out an expensive vintage I'd been saving, popping the cork with a celebratory sound that carried perfectly through the micro mic. She poured a glass, her face lit by the icy blue glow of her own phone on the counter. She was talking to someone on speakerphone, her laughter jagged and cold. "We're in the home stretch," she said, her voice dripping with anticipation. "Dr. Boyd is ready." The 4K feed was crystal clear, and as I watched Leonie lift her glass to the camera she didn't know was there, I heard the voice from the 3 a.m. voicemail finally identify itself on the other end of the line, discussing the payout. The altitude of the plane felt like a cruel joke. I was closer to heaven than ever, yet I was staring into the very pit of hell through a 4-inch glass screen. I gripped the armrests of my seat in the darkened cabin, the thin metallic hiss of the oxygen system sounding like a long, drawn-out sigh of despair. On the tablet propped on my tray table, the 4K feed was so sharp it felt like I could reach out and touch the marble countertops of my own kitchen. Leonie was still there, leaning over her phone on speakerphone, and then the voice on the other end spoke again. My blood turned to ice. Ethan Clark, a 30-year-old, with a razor-thin conscience and a mind for corporate theft, was the man I had stripped of his career 3 years ago. Now he was trying to strip me of my family. I remembered him as the aggressive young analyst I'd fired for corporate espionage, the one Leonie had recently introduced to me as her financial advisor. She'd claimed he was helping her grow her trust fund, but the conversation I was hearing now had nothing to do with market dividends and everything to do with a liquidation timeline. "Is the blueprint ready for the final sign-off?" Leonie Ethan's voice asked, crackling through the iPad's small speakers. Leonie didn't even look up from the wine glass she was swirling. "He's in the air, Ethan. The house is quiet." "It's time to close the contract," she replied. I hit the record button on the app, my hands shaking with a cold, predatory fury as I realized they weren't just taking my money. They were taking my life's foundation. I watched as Leonie set the wine glass down and moved toward the kitchen cabinets with a purpose that made my stomach churn. She reached into a hidden compartment I had built under the primary cabinet, a space I'd originally intended for the deed to the house, and pulled out a porcelain mortar and pestle. If you ever think you know what evil looks like, look at the face of a child smiling as they prepare their parents' last meal. She began to unpack several distinct types of pills from a nondescript plastic bag. I watched paralyzed by a clinical horror as she placed 3 white tablets and 2 blue ones into the bowl. The grinding sound of the mortar against the porcelain was faint, but distinct, a rhythmic, bone-chilling scratch that signaled the end of Ilara's lucidity. Leonie's hands were steady, the hands of a professional builder turned professional killer. She wasn't just crushing medication. She was crushing Ilara's ability to fight back, preparing a chemical leash of sedatives and scopolamine that would induce the perfect imitation of a terminal fog. "Just a little more sweetness for you, Mom. For your memory," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm the only one who takes care of you now." She stirred the white powder into a dark dark liquid, her focus absolute. Crush, stir, pour. The mechanics of murder were so simple. It was a structural demolition of a human mind executed with the same precision I used to plan a load-bearing wall. I leaned forward, my face inches from the cold blue glare of the screen. I watched the dark liquid swirl as the powder dissolved, a toxic dark brew that looked like nothing more than an evening comfort. Leonie checked the digital chime of her watch, a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. I realized then that this wasn't just a casual evening ritual. It was a synchronized act. She was timing the dosage with Ethan's arrival at the estate's perimeter. The plan was moving at a pace that suggested they had a deadline I hadn't yet calculated. I felt morally shattered, a man who had spent 40 years building safety into the world, only to find that the deadliest threat had been sleeping under his own roof. Leonie picked up the tray, arranging the cup and a small plate of crackers with a doting care that made me want to scream. She turned toward the master bedroom, the steam from the toxic brew rising like a ghost between her and the woman I loved. I gripped the armrests of my seat so hard, the leather groaned, watching through a 4K lens as Leonie pushed open the master bedroom door, the steam from that poisonous tea curling around her like a shroud. On the screen of my tablet, the image was so clear it felt like a physical violation of the space I had built for Ilara. I saw my wife lying back against the pillows, her movements slow and thick, her eyes already swimming in a chemical haze. Leonie didn't hesitate. She sat on the edge of the bed and forced a dazed Ilara to sit up, holding the porcelain cup to her lips with a tenderness that was more terrifying than a blade. Ilara tried to resist, her hand trembling as she pushed weakly at the saucer. "It tastes wrong, Leonie. It's metallic. Where is Thane?" My wife whispered, her voice a fragile rasp that made my heart shatter. Leonie didn't miss a beat, her face a mask of doting concern as she leaned in closer. "Drink it all, Mom. It's just a new honey blend the doctor sent over. You know how the episodes get when you skip your medicine. You're just confused again. I watched as Leonie revealed that she had been intercepting my calls for months, using a voice cloning app to convince Ilara that I was too busy with the Denver build to speak with her. She was erasing me from Ilara's mind, while poisoning her body a double-layered demolition that left me reeling in the cabin of the jet. I watched my wife's final moments of lucidity slip away as she drained the cup. The sedatives were aggressive, and within minutes, Ilara's drug-heavy eyelids began to flutter her head, eventually lolling back against the pillows as her breathing became a shallow, ragged ghost of its former self. Leonie stood over her for a moment, her eyes cold and clinical, before she adjusted the white noise generator. The faint, rhythmic hiss of the machine filled the silence of the room, masking the sounds of the house. Ilara wasn't a person to them anymore. She was just a structural obstacle, a piece of old timber that needed to be cleared for the new build. I sat paralyzed 30,000 feet in the air, watching as a shadow moved across the bedroom floor. Ethan Clark entered the frame through the master balcony doors, his boots making no sound on the heavy rug. He didn't even look at Ilara. His first move was toward the vanity to review a stack of legal documents. They spoke openly now, their voices picked up with terrifying clarity by the micro camera I'd hidden in the clock. "Is she out?" Ethan asked, his voice a flat corporate drone. "We don't have time for her to be confused anymore." Leonie checked Ilara's pulse with a detached efficiency. "The scopolamine is doing its job. She won't remember a thing even if she wakes up," she replied. I felt a cold, lethal focus settle over me, my mind already calculating the logistics of the response I would launch as soon as I touched the ground. How do you sit still in a metal tube at 30,000 feet while a man you once fired discusses the exact date of your wife's funeral? I watched Ethan reach into his jacket and pull out a sterile plastic case. He withdrew a syringe, the light reflecting off the cold, sterile glint of the needle. He explained that the natural stroke would be triggered by an air embolism, a clean, untraceable kill scheduled for the following Tuesday, when the cleaning crew was already booked to scrub the evidence away. He tapped the needle of the syringe, the light reflecting off the deadly bubble of air inside, as he looked at his watch and whispered, 10 days, Leonie. 10 days until we're worth 28 million. I stared at the screen at the bubble that represented the end of my world, and my finger hovered over the satellite phone on the console. The game had changed from surveillance to survival. My thumb hovered over the dial pad of the satellite phone, my vision blurring as I watched that bubble of air in Ethan's syringe, a tiny, translucent executioner waiting for a Tuesday that I was going to make sure never arrived. The leather armrest of my seat felt unnaturally cold against my palm. I was 30,000 feet over Nebraska, trapped in a metal tube, but the digital clarity of the 4K feed made me feel as though I were standing right there in the Adina bedroom, close enough to smell the Earl Grey and the betrayal. I didn't hesitate. I punched in a number I hadn't dialed in 5 years, the plastic click of the satellite phone buttons echoing in the quiet cabin like a countdown. Agent Christine Parker, a 43-year-old federal investigator with a voice like sharpened flint, was the woman who had helped me dismantle a billion-dollar kickback scheme 5 years ago. When she answered, I didn't offer a greeting. "Christine, it's Thane Garrison," I said, my voice as hard as the steel beams I used to inspect. "I'm sending you a link and encrypted credentials. Look at the master bedroom feed immediately." The line crackled for a heartbeat before her professional mask fell away. "I see it, Thane." My God. Is that a sedative cocktail or something worse? It was the moment the floor gave way. Agent Parker revealed that the FBI already had an open file on Ethan Clark for an unrelated offshore money laundering scheme, meaning my evidence was the final piece they needed for a no-knock federal warrant. The predator I was hunting was already on their radar. I had just provided the target acquisition. In construction, you have a contingency for a failed beam or a late shipment. But how do you plan for the moment your own daughter becomes the demolition crew? I stared at the jittery reflection of the phone screen in the jet window, the metallic smell of recycled air filling my lungs. I explained the history of Ethan Clark and the medical fraud involving Dr. Boyd, emphasizing that this wasn't just a family dispute, but a coordinated capital crime aimed at my wife's life and our estate. Agent Parker's tone shifted into a calculated coldness that I recognized and welcomed. She confirmed that the scopolamine and the documented threat of the air embolism moved this into federal jurisdiction. We need a ghost extraction. I told her, my mind already drafting a tactical blueprint. If Leonie sees a siren, she'll empty that syringe before you hit the driveway. I provided her with the structural details of my home, the reinforced doors, the silent alarms, and the entry points Leonie didn't know I still monitored. I knew every joist and crawl space of that estate. I had built it to be a sanctuary, and now I was giving the FBI the map to invade it. The line crackled. Parker's voice turned to ice. "We're taking the house, Thane." She began coordinating with a specialized tactical medical team in Minneapolis, ensuring they would be ready to move the moment I landed. "We're initiating the protocol now," she continued. "You land in 3 hours. We'll have a secure terminal ready for your arrival." I gripped the phone, my knuckles white as the hum of the jet's ventilation seemed to grow louder in the silence. Through the speakers, Leonie's voice drifted again, a hollow sound that didn't belong to the daughter I'd raised. She was discussing the service at the crematorium with Ethan, her words casual and cold. She planned to have Alara cremated immediately following the stroke to destroy any toxicological evidence of the scopolamine. The realization that they had thought of everything, the medical diagnosis, the forged documents, the disposal of the body, made me realize I wasn't just flying home for an anniversary. I was flying into a war zone. I closed my eyes, the coldness of the leather seat seeping into my skin, and prepared for the demolition of the life I had built. I didn't give Leonie the chance to bridge the gap. I moved with the explosive force of a controlled demolition, twisting the steak knife from her hand before her sociopathic brain could even register my presence. She let out a sharp, indignant yelp, but I ignored her, passing the blade to Beckett and leaving him to keep Leonie and Ethan pinned against the stainless steel cabinets of the kitchen. My focus was upstairs, drawn by that weak, rhythmic coughing that signaled the structural failure of my wife's health. I sprinted up the oak staircase, the sounds of the struggle in the kitchen fading behind me. When I reached the master suite, I found the door locked from the outside, a physical manifestation of the cage Leonie had built to keep her mother contained. I didn't reach for my keys. I took a sharp intake of breath, braced my shoulder, and utilized 30 years of knowing exactly where a frame was weakest to hit the door with everything I had. I felt the wood splinter and give way under my weight, the door swinging open to reveal a room that smelled of stale air and chemical decay. I found Alara in the darkness, her skin a sickly gray under the dim moonlight. "I'm here, Alara. The builder is back." I whispered, my heart fracturing as I saw her vacant gaze. "Thane," she rasped, her voice barely a thread. "Is it?" Finally Tuesday, I realized then that Leonie had even removed the smoke detectors in the room, stripping away every possible way for Alara to signal the outside world for help. Crash. The door gave way. The lie followed. I didn't waste a second. I pulled a heavy wool duvet from the foot of the bed and wrapped Alara's frail, shivering body in it, lifting her into my arms. I was stunned by how light she had become, as if her very essence had been hollowed out under Leonie's care. As I carried her back toward the stairs, the front doors of the estate were kicked open, and Agent Christine Parker led a flood of FBI agents into the foyer. The blinding blue and red strobe of the police lights outside cut through the house like a searchlight. "Thane, we have the medical unit on the perimeter," Parker shouted over the chaos, her voice a steady anchor. I didn't stop to explain. I bypassed the agents who were already zip-tying Ethan in the kitchen, focused only on the frail woman in my arms. "Medical, get the dialysis unit prepped now," I roared, As I crossed the threshold of my own house, heading for the ambulance idling in the driveway, Leonie was being led out by two officers. Her designer dress rumpled, still screaming at the top of her lungs about my absenteeism and my supposed mental instability. "Don't let them touch her. She's my mother." She shrieked, her face a mask of frantic animalistic greed. "You think a parent's love is unconditional? Try watching your child kill you for a bank balance and see how fast the conditions change." In the driveway, under the artificial glare of industrial floodlights, I signaled for the medical team to pause the gurney for a single moment as Leonie was led past. She was still spewing lies, her voice a jagged glass edge. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my tablet, the cold, digital glow of the screen illuminating the dark. I played the 4K still frame of Leonie meticulously crushing those pills into the tea, holding the evidence inches from her widening eyes, until she finally went silent. "Look at the screen, Leonie. This is the blueprint of your future. It's built of steel bars and concrete floors," I said, my voice as cold as a Minnesota winter. She stared at the image of her own betrayal, her lips trembling. I can explain. Ethan made me. She stammered, the doting daughter act finally disintegrating into a pathetic pile of excuses. As the officers pushed her toward the waiting cruiser, she screamed out that Dr. Boyd was already on a plane to a non-extradition country. I watched her go, knowing she was unaware that I had already coordinated with Agent Parker to intercept the doctor's flight path over the Atlantic. I watched the cruiser pull away, but as I turned back to the ambulance, Agent Parker whispered that the toxins in Alara's blood were even more complex than the initial labs suggested. My hand tightened on Alara's cold fingers as the sirens began to scream. The ambulance didn't just drive. It tore through the midnight streets of Edina, a streak of white and red fury that felt like the only thing keeping my wife's fading heartbeat from flatlining into the Minnesota frost. I gripped Alara's hand inside the swaying high-tech cabin, my eyes fixed on the rhythmic thumping of the floor beneath my boots. The sirens were a jagged scream in the night, yet they were the only music I wanted to hear. A lead paramedic, his face tight with focus, leaned over a monitor. "Her vitals are bottoming out. We need a direct line to toxicology," he shouted. I learned right then that the ambulance Leonie had on standby for her planned Tuesday stroke wasn't a medical vehicle at all, but a private transport owned by one of Ethan Clark's shell companies. It had been a Harzin waiting. "Stay with me, Alara. I just got you back. Don't you dare leave me now," I whispered, though my voice was nearly lost in the metallic howl of the vehicle. I was haunted by the warning Agent Parker had whispered earlier. Complex toxins. I watched the paramedics struggle to stabilize Alara's plummeting blood pressure, and I realized that while I had won the physical battle at our home, the chemical war inside my wife's body was only just reaching its most lethal phase. You spend your life calculating the load-bearing capacity of steel, but nothing prepares you for the moment you have to calculate the survival odds of your own soul. The ambulance slid into the bay of a secure, undisclosed hospital floor, prepped by the FBI, the screech of gurney wheels on polished tiles echoing like a gunshot. The smell of ozone and industrial-grade disinfectant hit me as we moved through the flickering, fluorescent lights of the intake bay. I was abruptly barred from the emergency detox suite as a team of specialists took over. "Mr. Garrison, you need to step back. We are moving to full-body dialysis," a voice commanded. I stood in the hallway, pressed against the cold wall, watching through a small glass pane as they initiated a rapid sequence intubation. I watched them work on her, a flurry of blue scrubs and silver instruments, and the isolation felt heavier than any skyscraper I had ever raised. "Tell me she's going to wake up. Just tell me that," I begged a passing nurse. But she didn't even look up. The machinery hummed, the monitors beeped, and I was left with the silence that only exists in hospitals and morgues. Hours bled into the early morning before a doctor finally emerged. "Doctor," Elena Ortiz, a 50-year-old toxicologist with eyes that had seen the worst of human cruelty, gripped her clipboard like a shield as she approached me. Her face was a mask of exhausted professional concern. It wasn't just a poisoning thane. It was a chemical erasure, she said, her voice dropping into a low, somber tone. She revealed that the complex toxins weren't just simple sedatives. They were a calculated neurodegenerative cocktail designed to mimic Alzheimer's, while slowly and systematically shutting down the central nervous system. Ilara had been less than 72 hours away from a total system collapse. Then she delivered the crushing news that made the world tilt on its axis. The specific scopolamine concentration found in Ilara's system could only have been sourced from a high-security research facility, pointing to a much larger criminal network than just a rogue doctor and a greedy daughter. Even if we clear her blood, the mind we remember, it might not come back entirely, she whispered. I sat alone in the sterile waiting room, the cold, stale taste of hospital coffee like ash in my mouth. I sat on that plastic chair, the scent of antiseptic burning my throat, as I realized the $28 million wasn't just a payout for Leonie. It was the buy-in for something much darker. Agent Parker's heels clicked against the sterile tile with the rhythm of a firing squad as she walked toward me, her face illuminated by the cold blue glow of a laptop screen that held the price tag for my wife's life. I sat in the corner of the secure waiting room, my back against the unforgiving plastic of the chair, feeling the weight of the last few hours settle into my marrow. The smell of industrial floor wax was thick in the air, a scent I usually associated with a finished lobby, but now it felt like the smell of an ending. I watched the blue-tinted shadows under Parker's eyes as she sat across from me, the hum of the laptop fan, the only sound in the small windowless space. She didn't offer comfort. She offered data. I leaned forward, my mouth dry as a construction site in July, watching her fingers dance across the mouse with a cold, metallic click. I learned that Leonie's financial tailspin wasn't a slow erosion of character, but a catastrophic structural failure. The forensic report showed a series of massive wire transfers to an offshore gambling syndicate known as the Red Vault. My daughter hadn't just made a mistake. She had been trapped. Her debt didn't come from a series of bad hands over a lifetime. It was a single weekend loss in a rigged game designed specifically to trap wealthy heirs with deep trusts and even deeper insecurities. $4 million in gambling debt? I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel under a tread. How did she even get through the door? They didn't want your money, Thane Parker replied, her voice as flat as a spirit level. They wanted the interest on your wife's pulse. To a builder, a spreadsheet is a promise of completion. To these monsters, it was a ledger of a slow-motion execution. Parker clicked into a specific encrypted file found on Ethan Clark's server, and the air in my lungs felt like it had turned to concrete. The document was titled Garrison Liquidation. It was a cold, mechanical blueprint for the dismantling of my entire existence. I watched the columns scroll by Ilara's jewelry with estimated resale values, the inventory of her art gallery, and even the Adina estate with projected auction dates. They had an auction date for her engagement ring, I whispered, staring at the screen where the symbol of my life's commitment was reduced to a SKU number. It's scheduled for next month. Ethan wasn't the lover Thane. He was the liquidator. He was the bridge between your daughter and the syndicate. The most horrifying column on the sheet was labeled D+date. I realized with a sickening jolt that it was a calculation of how quickly the trust would clear after a confirmed natural passing. They had timed her death to maximize their profit margins, ensuring the insurance and the trust would pay out before any forensic questions could be raised. I felt a calculated fury rising in my chest, a cold, strategic realization that the daughter I had raised had sold the blueprints of our home to the very wolves at the door. How do you explain to a man who built a legacy that his own blood sold the blueprints for scraps. I stared at the screen, my mind already calculating the counter-demolition I was going to launch. But as Parker scrolled further into the syndicate's contact list, I saw a name that made the world tilt on its axis. It wasn't just a list of criminals and gamblers. I recognized the name of a rival developer, a man I'd shared cocktails with at the country club for years. This was the same man who had been trying to force me into a merger, a hostile takeover of my firm that I had resisted at every turn. I realized then that my daughter was just the tool he had used to break my foundation. He hadn't just wanted my company. He had wanted my family's total destruction to clear the path for his own. I stared at the name on the screen, a man I'd shared cocktails with at the country club, and realized that my daughter was just the tool he used to break my foundation. I watched the clinical white of Dr. Boyd's office transform into a sea of tactical black and blue, my tablet screen capturing the exact moment the architect of Alara's misery realized his tenure as a god in a white coat was officially over. I was sitting in a nondescript FBI surveillance van 2 blocks away, the hum of the cooling fans and the smell of stale coffee grounding me as the raid began. Through the hidden security feed I had patched into, I saw Dr. Kenneth Boyd freeze. He wasn't looking at a patient. He was staring at a proximity sensor alert on his phone. His disheveled silver hair caught the light as he scrambled toward a heavy-duty shredder in the corner. The rhythmic whir of the document shredder started up a desperate grinding sound as he began feeding Alara's real medical records into the teeth of the machine. Secure the servers. Don't let him wipe the patient logs. Agent Parker's voice crackled through the comms. The tactical team burst through the reinforced oak doors, but Boyd was a man who had built his own sewer exits. He managed to slip through a pre-planned escape hatch, hidden behind the vanity in his private bathroom. "He's in the wall, check for a service elevator," a voice screamed. I discovered right then that Boyd wasn't just planning a simple flight. He had a dead man's switch in his cloud storage set to release Alara's falsified Alzheimer's records to the public if he didn't check in every 6 hours. He had intended to bury her reputation, even if he couldn't bury her body. A rat always knows where the sewer exits are, and Boyd had spent years digging his tunnels under the cover of his Hippocratic oath. I received a frantic update from Agent Parker that Boyd's burner phone had just pinged at a private airstrip near St. Paul. I didn't wait for permission. I threw my SUV into gear, my mind calculating the doctor's flight path based on the fuel capacity of the small Cirrus jet I knew was registered to one of Ethan's shell companies. The cold bite of the autumn Minnesota wind whipped against my face as I raced toward the airfield, the sky a bruised purple over the horizon. I arrived at the perimeter fence just as the first wave of FBI cruisers swerved onto the runway, their sirens a jagged howl. "He's got a flight plan for the Bahamas. We have 3 minutes before he's in the air." Parker's voice was an icy whip. "Ground the plane. Use the SUVs to block the wings." I watched from the fence line, my knuckles white against the chain link, as the black cruisers pinned the small jet against the massive steel hangar doors. Tires screamed. The jet braked. The sky was closed for business. The whine of the jet turbine died down into a pathetic whistle, and the smell of aviation fuel and burnt rubber filled the air. I saw the cockpit door fly open. Dr. Boyd was pulled from the seat by 3 tactical agents, his expensive silk shirt stained with jet fuel and grease. He looked like a broken man, but his eyes were still full of venom. As they dragged him across the concrete toward the lead cruiser, he began to scream, his voice cracking with a frantic, high-pitched desperation. It was Leonie. She was the one who suggested the air embolism. He shrieked, his face contorted with terror. She was the alpha. I only provided the tools. I stood there watching the man who had tried to erase my wife's soul, and I felt a cold sense of closure that offered no comfort. Boyd was face down on the concrete, his disheveled silver hair matted with sweat, but the look he gave me as he was dragged away told me that the dead man's switch had already been triggered. I checked my phone. The first news alerts were already popping up, headlines screaming about the secret mental decline of the Garrison matriarch. The structural damage to Ilara's life was now being broadcast to the very world she had spent decades trying to inspire. I didn't have time to celebrate Boyd's arrest. As I stepped back into Ilara's hospital room, my phone erupted with notifications. The dead man's switch had released a flood of falsified psychiatric reports to every major donor of our family foundation. The vibration in my pocket felt like a frantic mechanical heartbeat, a warning that the structural integrity of Ilara's reputation was being systematically demolished. I stood by the bed, the smell of ozone and disinfectant sharp in my nostrils, as Agent Parker and I reviewed the data dump. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. The files contained fabricated neurological assessments, suggesting Ilara had been suffering from progressive dementia for years, and that I had been hiding her to maintain control of the Garrison trust. She didn't just want her dead Parker. She wanted her legacy erased. I rasped, my fury tightening into a cold, hard knot. I realized this was Leonie's ultimate contingency to destroy Ilara's credibility, so that any testimony she gave would be dismissed as the delusional ramblings of a broken mind. Parker didn't look up from the screen, her face set in a grim line. "We'll counter it with the 4K footage, Thane." Hard data beats a doctored psychiatric report every time, she assured me, but I knew the damage was already spreading through the digital ether like a contagion. Have you ever looked into the eyes of the person you love and realized they've been screaming for help from inside their own skin for a year? I turned back to the bed as the heart monitor rhythm shifted its steady beep, quickening into a sharp, insistent tempo. Ilara's eyes fluttered open, the glassy, vacant stare replaced by a sudden, painful clarity that nearly brought me to my knees. She recognized me instantly, her hand reaching out for mine with a strength that surprised the nursing staff. "Thane," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a rasp. The cold, dry texture of her hand felt like parchment against my palm. She began to speak the words, spilling out in a desperate rush, as if she were afraid the fog would reclaim her. She revealed a level of cruelty I hadn't even imagined. Leonie had been recording Ilara's confused moments for months to build the dementia narrative, but she was actually using a taser-like device hidden off-camera to provoke the physical spasms and terror seen in the videos. My daughter hadn't just been a poisoner. She had been a torturer. She remembered every drop of tea, every cold smile. I heard her Thane. I couldn't move my tongue, but I heard her laughing. With that man in our kitchen, Ilara said, her eyes filling with a raw, agonizing heartbreak. She told me the tea was for my own good. She called it mercy while she held the glass to my lips. We sat there in the shared silence of a shattered life, the rhythmic beep of the monitor, the only witness to our grief. But the relief of her awakening was short-lived. Ilara gripped my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin with a sudden sharp intensity. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly low frequency. Leonie's final words before they took me away. She threatened me. She said if she went to jail, she had already arranged for a second team to finish the job here at the hospital. My blood turned to ice. The extraction hadn't been the end. It was just the midpoint of the demolition. Ilara looked toward the door, her pupils widening as a sharp, unfamiliar nurse's uniform flickered past the glass observation pane. Ilara gripped my arm, her voice a ghost of a rasp, as she looked at the door and whispered, "Thane, the nurse who just left. She's not on the hospital staff list I saw earlier." I didn't wait for the fake nurse to reach for her tray. I lunged for the security alarm, my hand slamming the red button as I pulled Ilara's bed into the bathroom, locking the reinforced door just as the first shot shattered the hallway glass. The vibration of the red alarm button pulsed through my palm, a frantic mechanical heartbeat that matched the adrenaline flooding my system. Inside the small bathroom, the smell of ozone and industrial bleach felt suffocating, but it was a sanctuary. I held Ilara close, her frail body shaking against me as the muffled sounds of a struggle erupted in the suite. The sharp crack of a second gunshot hitting glass echoed through the vents. It lasted less than 2 minutes. When Agent Parker finally signaled the all-clear, the nurse was face down in the hallway, neutralized by the FBI security detail. Parker confirmed the assassin was a professional cleaner hired by Ethan's syndicate. My jaw tightened until it ached. I realized right then that as long as Leonie believed she had a single percentage point of a chance at the Garrison fortune, Ilara would never truly be safe. They're not stopping Parker. They'll keep coming as long as there's a trust fund to inherit. I said, my voice as cold and hard as the steel joists I'd spent my life inspecting. Parker looked at me with concern. You're going to the jail. Thane, she's highly manipulative. I didn't care. I made a cold executive decision to end the familial bond once and for all. I needed to perform a total demolition of her hope. A building that's been condemned doesn't need a renovation. It needs a wrecking ball. I was that ball. 2 days later, I arrived at the Hennepin County Jail, the cold hum of the ventilation system, providing a sterile backdrop to the smell of industrial cleaner and unwashed bodies. I sat behind the reinforced glass of the visiting room, my hands steady on the cold metal counter. Leonie was brought out looking disheveled, but immediately launching into a performance of hysterical grief. Dad, thank God Ethan made me do it. He threatened to kill me. She wailed, her eyes leaking tears that I now saw as nothing more than theatrical props. I remained silent, watching her facial micro-expressions, with the same scrutiny I used to inspect a failing steel joint under stress. I didn't see remorse. I saw a cornered predator calculating her next exit. I revealed to her that the security footage from the hospital didn't just catch the assassin, but recorded the very call she had made from a smuggled jail phone earlier that night, authorizing the hit. I'm not here as your father, Leonie. I'm here as the executor of a legacy you tried to bury, I told her, my voice devoid of any warmth. I slid a thick legal document against the glass, a total and irrevocable disinheritance, and a petition to the state to strip her of the Garrison surname. She stopped crying. The mask fell. The monster looked back at me. Her eyes narrowed, the blue turning to a flat, predatory gray. You can't do that, she hissed, her voice dropping the act. That money is mine by right. I looked at her, feeling a clinical detachment I hadn't known I possessed. I informed her then that the $28 million Garrison Trust had already been dissolved and moved into a protected charitable foundation for elder abuse victims. Her inheritance now had a literal value of 0. The foundation is ironclad, Leonie. You killed the daughter I loved, so I killed the future you wanted. She stared at the paper, the reality of her bankruptcy finally sinking in. She wasn't just losing her freedom. She was losing the prize she had sold her soul for. Leonie lunged at the glass, her fingernails screeching against the surface like an animal's, the sound piercing the quiet room. Her face was contorted with a desperate animalistic greed, her mouth opening to scream obscenities I refused to hear. I didn't flinch. I just stood up, adjusted my watch, and turned my back on her, leaving her to the silence of the cell she'd built for herself. The structural repair was finally complete, even if the building was now half empty. I didn't give Howard Barnes the courtesy of a phone call. I walked into his mahogany-lined office with the FBI as the vanguard, watching the color drain from his face like spilled grout as they began seizing the files that held the remains of my wife's stolen future. Howard Barnes, a 59-year-old estate lawyer with silver-cuffed sleeves and a reputation for ironclad trusts, looked like a man who had just watched his own foundation crumble in real time. He stood behind a desk that smelled of expensive leather and old paper, his hands trembling as he reached for a telephone he was never going to be allowed to use. I discovered right then that the rot went deeper than I'd feared. Howard hadn't just looked the other way. He had a secondary insurance policy on my own life taken out by Leonie, which would have tripled his payout if Alara's death had been followed by my own accidental suicide. I watched Agent Parker's team move through the space, their blue FBI windbreakers, a sharp clinical contrast against the warm mahogany walls. They uncovered a vault of falsified documents, including the original trust amendment Leonie had forced Alara to sign. It was already stamped and notarized by Barnes, despite the fact that Alara hadn't stepped foot in this building for over a year. "I've represented you for 20 years, Thane. You can't do this." Howard stammered, his voice cracking with the cold, metallic taste of fear. I leaned over his desk, my gaze level and unforgiving. "You didn't represent me, Howard. You represented the price of your own silence. How many years of friendship is a man's soul worth?" For Howard, the answer was $50,000 and a seat on a board that didn't exist. I watched as they hauled him out, realizing he had been laundering Leonie's gambling allowance through fake corporate expenses for years. He was the legal pillar that had allowed the poison to spread. As we exited the building, the air of downtown Minneapolis was thick with the blinding pop of camera flashes. The local news crews had arrived like vultures to a carcass, tipped off by the commotion of the raid. The Adina poisoning headline was already spreading like a structural fire through social media. I threw myself into the back of the SUV, the heavy door thudding shut to provide a temporary barrier against the chaos. "Turn off the radio, Thane. It's a circus out there," Parker said, her voice tight as she climbed in beside me. I ignored her, staring at my phone as the first leaked images of Alara's gurney being carried out of our house appeared online. "They're calling her the silent heiress," I muttered, feeling a protective anger boil in my gut. They have no idea she was screaming the whole time. Our privacy wasn't just compromised. It was a casualty of the war Leonie had started. Flashbulbs. The sharks were in the water. We needed to move. The low hum of the SUV's tires on the wet pavement was the only sound as we accelerated away from the courthouse. I felt a sense of professional vindication as the legal pillars of the conspiracy were dismantled, but it was hollowed out by the sheer scale of the betrayal. A local reporter on the screen mentioned that Leonie had even been secretly filming a caregiver documentary to sell to a streaming service, planning to profit from Alara's staged decline even after she was gone. The calculated nature of it made my stomach turn. Every smile, every doting touch I had seen in those fake videos had been a commodity. The world wanted a piece of the Garrison tragedy, but as I pulled the SUV onto the highway toward Lake Minnetonka, seeking the only perimeter I had left to defend, I realized the data dump from the dead man's switch contained one file we hadn't opened, a file addressed to me from Alara dated 2 years ago. I stared at the icon on the tablet, my thumb hovering over the screen, wondering what truth my wife had tried to tell me before the tea went cold. The snow fell in heavy, silent curtains over Lake Minnetonka, burying the noise of the city and the scandal, as if the earth itself was trying to provide the clean slate I wasn't sure we deserved. The heavy iron gates of the lake estate had swung shut weeks ago, locking the chaos of the world outside the Garrison perimeter. Inside, the only sound was the soft crackle of a library fire and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. I sat in a leather armchair, my fingers tracing the edge of the tablet that held the final piece of the wreckage. I finally opened the file Alara had written 2 years ago. It wasn't a clinical report or a legal threat. It was a letter raw and prophetic. The file revealed a secret. Alara had actually set up a secret emergency fund for me years ago, hidden in an offshore trust I couldn't touch until now, because she had anticipated that Leonie might one day try to drain our main accounts. She had seen the hairline cracks in our daughter's character before I had even looked at the blueprints. In the letter, Alara described her growing fear that something cold was coming between her and Leonie, a hollow hunger she couldn't name. I shared the words with Alara as she sat wrapped in a heavy weight of a wool blanket, her eyes tracking the lines with painful clarity. She knew Alara. She knew we loved her, and she used it as the first point of entry. I said, my voice thick with cathartic sadness. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to believe my own blood could be so hollow, she whispered. We sat in the shared light of the library fire, finding necessary closure in the admission of our shared blindness. Can you ever truly burn a memory, or do you just learn to live with the smell of smoke? The question haunted me as I spent a crisp afternoon dragging a heavy cardboard box to the stone fire pit by the frozen lake. It was filled with the artifacts of a life that had been a lie. Leonie's academic awards, silver-framed photos, and the high-end clothes she had bought with stolen trust funds. Alara joined me, the bite of sub-zero air on her face, turning her cheeks a faint pink. She didn't hesitate. She held the match, her hand still possessing a slight tremor, and struck it against the stone. The match flared. The past caught fire. We watched as the silk and paper turned to black ash, the smell of burning silk and wood smoke rising into the darkening sky. It has to go, Alara. Every scrap of the lie, I said. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the orange sparks flying into a black sky. Let the wind take the rest of her. We have a winter to survive. We stood there until the flames died down to glowing embers, performing a structural necessity to clear the site for whatever new life we could manage to build from the debris. Christmas Eve arrived with a quietude I hadn't known in decades. There were no gala invitations, and no $28 million empire to defend. We spent the evening in the great room, the only light coming from the fireplace, and a few modest candles. Alara's hands still trembled when she held her mug of tea, but her eyes were bright and focused. Merry Christmas, Thane. We're still standing, she said. I realized then that the strongest structures aren't the ones that never crack. They're the ones that refuse to fall. As we sat there, my phone vibrated. It was a final text from Agent Parker. Leonie had refused all visitors in prison and had begun referring to herself by Ethan's last name, fully embracing her identity as a predator. I didn't show the message to Alara. We sat together as the last embers died out, the weight of the year finally lifting. But as I looked at the dark expanse of the lake, I knew that while the house was secure, the world would never look the same to the man who had seen the blueprint of his own daughter's hate. We were survivors looking toward an uncertain but shared future. The transition from the silence of Lake Minnetonka to the marble echo of the federal courthouse felt like stepping from a sanctuary back into a demolition zone. I gripped my briefcase, the leather cold against my palm, as I walked through the security scanners. The weight of the last year had finally begun to lift during the winter, but as the trial date for Leonie and Ethan Clark loomed, the pressure returned with the force of a hydraulic press. I had seen the blueprint of my daughter's hate, and now I was expected to watch the world dissect it. I entered the U.S. Attorney's office, where the smell of industrial carpet cleaner and old law books hung thick in the air. Marcus Thorne, a 48-year-old prosecutor with a razor-thin smile and a reputation for winning the cases that everyone else deemed too messy, looked at me with the eyes of a man who saw humans as nothing more than evidence points. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, my gaze fixed on the mountain of evidence boxes stacked against the mahogany walls. I learned right then that the defense had successfully petitioned to have the 4K footage of the bitter tea suppressed on a technicality regarding the signal jammer's legality. It was a structural failure in our strategy I hadn't anticipated. Without that video, we were forced to rely on Alara's fragile recovering memory to prove the poisoning happened at all. Marcus flicked a switch, and the blue-white flickering of a projector screen filled the room. I watched a clip of Leonie's pre-trial deposition. She looked pale, fragile, and utterly convincing, her voice trembling as she spoke of her deep love for her mother. The sight of her tear-streaked face on a high-definition monitor made my stomach turn. They aren't going to fight the facts, Thane. They're going to fight the narrative, Thorne said, his voice as flat as a spirit level. She's playing the part of the lonely daughter abandoned by a billionaire father. It's a classic play for jury sympathy. How do you defend the truth when the lie is wearing your daughter's face and crying for mercy? I had built a fortress to protect Ilara, but in this room, the walls felt like they were made of glass. Marcus leaned forward, the cold weight of a heavy legal brief landing on the table between us. They're calling you the puppet master Thane. They want the jury to think you're the one who pushed Leonie to the edge to seize control of the trust. I listened as Thorne revealed the defense's theory of the case. They were painting me as a cold, calculating architect who orchestrated the entire surveillance setup to frame my own daughter before Ilara could divorce me. It was a fabrication, a twisted mirror image of the truth. They had even found a witness, a disgruntled former site foreman I had fired for safety violations, who was willing to testify that I had a history of forging structural reports. The sound of a city bus hissing outside the window punctuated the silence, as I realized the defense wasn't trying to prove Leonie innocent. They were trying to make me look just as guilty. I didn't build a 4K trap to frame her. I built a window into the hell she was creating. I growled, my righteous indignation boiling over. But the file slammed shut. The trap was changing shape. Thorne looked at me with a grim finality, handing me a folder containing Leonie's recent correspondence from jail. I discovered she had been writing letters of apology to Ilara. But as I scanned the text, I saw the coded threats, specific references to the second team and the hospital that were meant to trigger Ilara's PTSD before she ever took the stand. Thorne handed me a final document, a subpoena for Ilara to testify in person, and I knew the defense was counting on her breaking down under the glare of the courtroom lights. I walked to the witness stand with the weight of 30 years of building steel pushing against my spine, knowing that today the only thing I was constructing was the cage for my own daughter. The courtroom was a cavern of stale wood polish and old paper, the air kept artificially chilled by a hum that vibrated in my teeth. Elena Vance, a 42-year-old defense attorney, with the predatory grace of a hawk and a suit that cost more than a mid-range sedan, circled me like I was a structure she intended to demolish. She began her assault immediately painting me as an absentee billionaire who preferred the company of skyscrapers to his own family. Mr. Garrison, isn't it true you only saved your wife when you realized her trust fund was being redirected? She asked, her voice dripping with practiced disdain. I maintained a stoic professional demeanor, refusing to let the bait of her temper take hold. I saved my wife because her life has no price tag, unlike the ethics of your clients. I replied, my voice level and precise. I described the moment I saw the bruises on Ilara's arm, not as a grieving husband, but as a forensic investigator documenting the catastrophic failure of a support system. I saw the rhythmic tap of the court reporter's keys accelerating, capturing every word of the structural collapse I was describing. Silence. Then the first juror turned away from the screen, unable to watch the slow-motion murder. The defense's narrative began to crack when I revealed a detail I had kept in reserve for the stand. I didn't just install cameras. I told the jury, my eyes locking onto the row of citizens who held the future in their hands. I had the floor joists in my wife's room fitted with high-sensitivity pressure sensors. I have the digital logs proving that Leonie and Ethan Clark were in that room together at 3 a.m. on the night they discussed the air embolism. Vance's face paled, the grout of her defense crumbling in real time. Prosecutor Thorne didn't miss the opening. He stood making a surprise motion to admit the previously suppressed 4K video footage. He produced new forensic data showing that the signal jammer used during the incident was registered to Ethan Clark, not me, effectively nullifying the technicality that had kept our best evidence in the dark. Judge Sterling reviewed the data for a tense, silent minute before nodding toward the tech desk. The lights in the courtroom dimmed the blue tint of the 4K video, reflecting off the faces of the jurors as the monitors flared to life. The courtroom felt like a building in the seconds after the support beams are blown, a vacuum of sound, before the total collapse. On the massive screens, Leonie's cold, smiling face was larger than life. The jury watched in visceral horror as she meticulously crushed the white and blue pills into the tea, her steady hands a testament to her lack of conscience. My God, look at her eyes. She's enjoying it. A woman in the front row whispered, her voice carrying through the hushed gallery. Beside me, I saw Leonie's fingernails digging into the oak table, her knuckles white with a pressure that was beginning to fracture her doting daughter persona. The footage played on a clinical record of betrayal that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. It was the physical proof of the poison, the blueprint of a murder that had been interrupted just in time. The collective intake of breath from the room was a physical force, a weight of judgment that settled over the defendant's chair. Suddenly, the pressure became too much. Leonie suffered a total breakdown, her chair screeching against the floor as she bolted upright. But she didn't cry for mercy. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She began to scream at the monitors, her voice a raw, jagged sound that filled every corner of the hall. She deserved it. She shrieked, her face contorted into the monster I had seen in my kitchen. She was too weak to run the empire. You would have let it all fall apart. Leonie's scream echoed through the hall, a raw, jagged sound that finally stripped away the innocent daughter mask, leaving the jury staring at the monster I had seen in my kitchen months ago. I sat back in the witness chair, my hands finally steady, watching the total demolition of the lie she had spent a year building. The courtroom doors opened with a heavy final thud as Ilara walked toward the witness stand, her steps measured and slow, her presence alone silencing the gallery more effectively than any judge's gavel ever could. I watched from the front row, my heart swollen with a mixture of pride and a lingering, icy dread. The heavy scent of old wood and floor wax hung thick in the air, a sensory reminder of the institutional weight of the law. Ilara took her seat, her back straight. Despite the chemical war, her body had barely survived. She didn't look at the defense table where Leonie sat slumped, but she testified with a quiet, devastating clarity that made the jury lean forward as one. She described the physical sensation of the scopolamine, the feeling of being buried alive, while watching her own daughter move through her home like a scavenger picking over a fresh kill. I am not a victim of Alzheimer's. I am a survivor of my daughter, she said, her voice resonant and firm. Every day she told me I was disappearing, she was the one erasing me. During her impact statement, she dropped a final piece of structural evidence that Leonie's team hadn't accounted for. Ilara revealed she had hidden one working micro-recorder Leonie missed in the bedroom lining, which had captured Ethan and Leonie discussing which crematorium would be least likely to check for chemical residue after the air embolism. It wasn't the medicine that broke me. It was the smile on her face while she served it. Guilty. The word hung in the air like a falling girder. The dry, paper-like sound of the verdict being read by the clerk felt like the first breath of clean air I'd taken in a year. The jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated financial fraud, and conspiracy. Leonie sat frozen, her doting daughter act, completely incinerated by the weight of the recordings. Judge Marcus Sterling, a man whose 70 years of life were reflected in a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the courthouse itself, stared down at Leonie with an expression of pure, objective disdain. He didn't offer the platitudes of a family counselor. You treated a human life like a line item on a spreadsheet, Leonie. Now the state will do the same with your freedom, he declared. He noted the extraordinary cruelty involved in the calculated chemical manipulation of a parent. When he handed down the sentence, 22 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole, the gallery remained hushed, the finality of the gavel strike sounding like the closing of a tomb. I watched as his daughter was led away, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing against the oak paneling. I felt no anger, only the cold satisfaction of a builder who has finally removed the rot from a foundation so a new structure can rise. The cuffs clicked. The cage door didn't just close, it was welded shut. As Leonie was dragged out, a final structural collapse occurred within the conspiracy. Ethan Clark's lawyer stood up to announce that his client had officially turned state's evidence against the rival developer who had funded the gamble. The entire syndicate was falling like a house of cards built on sand. I stood up and reached for Alara, the cold weight of her hand in mine finally starting to warm. 22 years. It's time to go home, Alara, I whispered. She leaned against me, and for the first time the trembling in her fingers seemed to subside. We walked down the courthouse steps into the bright Minnesota sun, the blinding glare reflecting off the marble as we left the circus behind. I didn't look over my shoulder. I didn't need to see the cruiser pulling away or the reporters scrambling for a quote. I knew the blueprint of this betrayal would be etched into my mind forever. But as we reached the car, I realized that while the house was secure, the world would never look the same. We were survivors heading toward the quiet rhythm of the lake, leaving the ruins of a life we no longer needed to inhabit. I watched the heavy oak doors of the Minnesota Supreme Court swing shut on Howard Barnes, knowing that while Leonie was behind bars, the man who had notarized our destruction was finally facing the quiet execution of his professional soul. The heavy scent of courtroom floor wax clung to my suit, a sterile reminder of the dozens of hearings I had endured to reach this moment of finality. I sat in the front row, my back as straight as the structural steel I'd spent a lifetime mastering, watching the disbarment board systematically strip Howard of his license. They cited hundreds of forged documents and the specific role he played in laundering Leonie's debt payments through my own corporate accounts. Barnes tried to meet my eye, a desperate plea for old times flickering in his gaze, but I remained unyielding. "You're not just losing a license, Howard. You're losing the right to speak for the voiceless," I told him as we passed in the hallway afterward. I was just following the client's instructions. Thane, he stammered the sharp snap of my briefcase closing, cutting off his final excuse. He had been a pillar of the community, but he was hollowed out by greed, and now his professional collapse was absolute. I walked out of the chambers without looking back, my mind already pivoting toward a new kind of construction. If you want to stop a rot from spreading, you don't just patch the drywall. You rip out the infected timber and replace it with something that can't be eaten away by greed. I spent the next 2 months working with Alara and Beckett Sterling to repurpose the $28 million Garrison Trust. We weren't just giving money away, we were providing the blueprints for survival. We transformed the fortune into the Alara Protection Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing forensic legal and medical audits for wealthy seniors at risk of exploitation. I oversaw every detail of the new headquarters in Minneapolis, ensuring it was both a sanctuary and a fortress. We integrated the same high-tech surveillance and pressure sensor technology I had used to save my wife into a comprehensive system for public good. The office space for the foundation was a poetic reclamation of the conspiracy's epicenter. I had purchased the very building Howard Barnes lost in his bankruptcy settlement. I stood in the lobby, the smell of fresh paint and glass. A welcome change from the dust of the courtroom, watching the blue glow of newly installed monitors flickering to life. "It's the most important thing we've ever built," Thane Beckett said, placing a hand on my shoulder. I nodded, feeling a redemptive purpose I hadn't known I was capable of. The foundation wasn't just a tax shelter. It was a lighthouse built over the wreck of our old lives. On a crisp October evening, we held a private, secure event to mark the official launch. Alara stood beside me, her eyes bright and focused, though she still leaned slightly on my arm for support. The sound of the ribbon being cut by her steady hand was the loudest noise in the room, a sharp declaration that we were no longer defined by the poison Leonie had served. During the reception, Agent Parker pulled me aside, her face illuminated by the flickering light of her smartphone. Thane, our first anonymous whistleblower report just came in, she whispered. It's already led us to a discovery involving a similar plot, fueled by that rival developer who held Leonie's gambling debt. It seems the Foundation is already doing its job. I felt a cold surge of tactical satisfaction. We had finally built something that couldn't be broken, a structure designed to protect others from the blueprint of hate I had seen in my own home. But as Ilara took the podium to address our donors, a familiar shadow in the back of the room caught my eye. A tall, well-dressed figure stood near the exit, watching her with a predatory stillness that made the hair on my neck stand up. I realized then that the rival developer wasn't done with the Garrison name yet, and the final resolution of my legacy was still being drafted in the dark. I didn't let the shadow in the back of the room reach the podium. I moved with a predator's grace, intercepting the rival developer's envoy before he could poison the air of our new sanctuary with a single word. The envoy, a 30-something man in a suit that tried too hard to look expensive, stood like a crack in a pristine wall. He had that oily, confident look of a man who thought money could buy a way out of any structural collapse. I stepped into his path, my frame casting a long shadow over him. I didn't wait for his rehearsed greeting. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a heavy manila folder, the weight of it a physical threat. "This is proof of your boss's complicity in the Red Vault Syndicate?" I said, my voice a low rumble that vibrated with absolute authority. "Tell him the foundations he's built on are made of sand. I'm the tide." "The Garrison Foundation isn't just a charity," I continued, leaning in until he could see the cold steel in my eyes. "It's a watchdog. If he so much as breathes near my wife or my firm again, I will dismantle him brick by brick." I watched the color drain from his face as he took the folder, his hands trembling. He turned and vanished into the crowd, a parasite scurrying away from the light. After the event, Agent Parker handed me a final piece of baggage, an unopened letter from the federal prison. "This is the last piece of mail I'll ever receive with that return address," I told her, tucking it away as a relic of a life I was finally ready to leave behind. Whir! The shredder didn't hesitate. Neither did I. A year later, the world was different. I stood on a stone balcony overlooking the rolling hills of Tuscany, the smell of lemon trees and warm earth rising to meet me in the golden afternoon. It was our 27th anniversary, a milestone I had once feared we would never see. Ilara stood beside me, the taste of aged Chianti on our lips, as we watched the sun dip toward the olive groves. I pulled the prison letter from my pocket, the paper yellowed and crisp. I hadn't opened it. I didn't need to. I noticed the weight was off, and when I shook the envelope, Leonie's signature gold ring fell into my palm. It was a pathetic gesture, a claim of ownership over the Garrison name that she had already forfeited. I didn't feel anger, only a profound sense of closure. I placed the ring on the stone railing and brought a heavy marble bookend down on it, with a single decisive strike. I felt the gold ring being crushed, the metal flattening into a useless, distorted shape. "Do you want to know what she wrote?" I asked Ilara. "Number." "Her voice doesn't live in this house." "Not anymore," she replied. Together we fed the unopened letter into a small portable shredder I had placed on the outdoor table. The Italian sun wasn't just light. It was a kiln firing the new bricks of a life that would never know the weight of a skyscraper again. The mechanical hum of the shredder was a final rhythmic erasure of the monster that had once shared our blood. We watched the ink of her lies turn into harmless white confetti. I took the tray of paper scraps to the edge of the balcony and tossed them into the valley wind. I watched the white scraps of the past vanish into the Italian dusk, drifting over green hills until they were nothing more than dust. Ilara took my hand, her grip firm and steady. I realized then that I had legally changed our last names to her maiden name months ago, a final structural repair that Leonie would never be able to undo. The Garrison legacy was a ruin, but we were the architects of something new. I realized I had finally built the one thing that could never be demolished, a home that existed in the heart, not in the stone. We stood there in the silence, two survivors watching the stars emerge over a world that was finally truly ours. I thought I had retired from building when I left the Minneapolis skyline behind, but standing in the terminal upon our return from Tuscany, I realized that the camera that saved my wife had become a blueprint for thousands of families I would never even meet. The world had transformed while we were away, the news of our survival turning into a global catalyst for change. As I stepped back into the lobby of our foundation headquarters, the cool touch of a marble countertop under my hand felt familiar, yet different. I was no longer constructing towers of glass. I was building a shield. Julian Vane, the man who was supposed to be my son-in-law, stood in the lobby looking like a man who had spent a year wandering through a structural collapse. He approached me with a tentative, heavy step, his eyes reflecting a deep, hollow exhaustion. I almost helped her, Thane. I almost believed the poison she spat about you, he said, his voice cracking with a gut-wrenching sincerity. Julian revealed that Leonie had attempted to reach out to him from prison to ask for bail money using a secret account I had missed, but he had turned the details over to the FBI instead of replying. I saw the wreckage Leonie had left in his wake, and I chose to offer him a path to redemption. She was an expert at finding the cracks in people, Julian. Don't let her stay inside your head, I said, offering a firm, steady grip of a handshake that signaled the end of his nightmare and the start of his work with us. How do you measure a life's work? Is it by the height of the towers, or by the people who sleep soundly because of the locks you put on the doors? This rhetorical question echoed in my mind as I walked through the Institute. The Ilara Protocol, the comprehensive suite of surveillance pressure sensors and legal audits I had pioneered, had gone global. In my private office, I watched a soft hum of a global news broadcast, showing families in London and Tokyo using my methods to secure their own elderly from predatory heirs. I realized my true legacy wasn't written in steel or glass, but in the safety of homes I've never stepped foot in. Ilara stood beside me, the scent of her familiar perfume a grounding force in the high-tech room. Her health was fully restored, her posture regal as she served as the face of a movement that transformed our private tragedy into a public shield. They're calling it the Master Builder's Shield, I told her, gesturing to a digital map glowing with protected homes across the continent. It's just a house, Thane. But for the first time, the walls are actually holding. She replied, her eyes bright with a focus that no chemical could ever dim again. The screen flickered. 1,000 thank yous scrolled by. I was finally done. As the afternoon light faded, Beckett Sterling entered the room, handing me a final report that felt like the last brick in a massive renovation. The data showed that the foundation's relentless legal work had finally bankrupted the rival developer's estate, effectively erasing every trace of the syndicate that had tried to dismantle my family. The structural integrity of our lives had been restored, and the predators were gone. I looked at the portrait of our family on the wall, the new one where only Ilara and I remained. And I knew that while the name Garrison was gone, the foundation I'd built would stand long after the skyscrapers turned to dust. The weight of 40 years of building for others had been replaced by the lightness of a home that no one could take away. I stood by the window with Ilara, watching the first snow of the season begin to fall over the city, knowing that the blueprints were safe and the structure was sound. I was finally truly home. The ice on Lake Minnetonka groaned under its own weight, a deep, resonant sound that once would have made me check the structural integrity of the world. But tonight, it was just the music of a winter I was finally at peace with. I stood by the large window of our lakeside retreat, the crisp, cold smell of pine and snow clinging to the glass. The warmth of a wood-burning stove radiated through the room, casting a soft amber glow that chased away the shadows of the past year. I watched the glint of stars over a frozen horizon, feeling a stillness in my bones that no skyscraper could ever provide. Ilara moved through the kitchen behind me, her silhouette fluid and graceful as she prepared a simple dinner. There were no caterers tonight, no polished silver or forced smiles. We moved with a synchronized grace that felt like a new blueprint, one built on the quiet trust between two survivors who had seen the worst of humanity and decided to keep walking anyway. "I think I'm done with skyscrapers, Ilara," I said, turning to watch her. "I'd rather spend my time making sure this roof stays over our heads." She looked up, a soft smile touching her lips. "The view from here is better anyway, Thane. We can actually see the stars, not just the lights of our own ambition. Time isn't a straight line. It's a circle. And tonight the circle finally closed with us on the inside." I looked at the dark expanse of the lake and thought about the Adina estate. I had systematically deconstructed that house brick by brick, selling the materials and the land to fund a massive expansion of our foundation. I wanted to ensure that the site of our betrayal could never be used as a home again. The land was now a public park, a space for growth rather than greed. The master builder had finally learned that the most important structures aren't made of steel, but of the moments we choose to protect. I took a final walk around the perimeter of the property as the countdown to midnight began. The deep, booming groan of the lake ice followed me, a reminder of the raw power of nature. I checked the security monitors one last time, not out of a lingering paranoia, but out of a sense of stewardship for the sanctuary I had created. I looked at the light in the window where Ilara waited for me, her presence a beacon in the winter dark. For the first time in 30 years, I wasn't building for a legacy that would outlive me. I was living for the woman who made the life worth building in the first place. Midnight. The world turned over. We stayed the same. The soft, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway signaled the change. As the final seconds of the year bled away, I returned to the living room and sat beside Ilara. I pulled up my private server one last time, the cold blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. With a single decisive keystroke, I deleted the last of the 4K surveillance footage from the poisoning. I didn't need the record of her suffering anymore. I chose to keep only the memories of her recovery and the sound of her laughter. The data vanished into the ether, a final erasure of the toxicity that had tried to claim us. The foundation is deep. The walls are true, I whispered more to myself than to her. Ilara leaned her head on my shoulder, her hand finding mine. "Let the new year come, Thane. We're ready." Distant fireworks over the lake were just flashes of light against the black sky, silent explosions that couldn't reach our peace. In the reflection of the glass, I saw the only thing that mattered, a man and a wife who had outlived their own destruction. The project was complete. The house was secure, the blueprints were burned, and for the first time in my life, the master builder was finally truly at rest. When I look back at this family story, I don't just see a crime, I see my own blindness. I built towers that could survive earthquakes, yet I ignored the tremors inside my own home. This family story forced me to admit something painful. Success in business does not equal wisdom in love. I confused silence with stability. I assumed blood guaranteed loyalty. I was wrong. If you learn anything from this family story, let it be this: do not wait for proof when your instincts are already whispering. Ask the hard questions early. Protect the vulnerable before the damage becomes irreversible. I told myself I was too busy providing. In truth, I was avoiding what felt uncomfortable. Don't be like me. Don't let pride or routine blind you to cracks forming in your own foundation. Some people call what I did dad revenge. But dad revenge was never about punishment. It was about protection. Real dad revenge is choosing courage over denial. It is standing between danger and the person you love, even when that danger shares your last name. There were nights I asked God why this happened, and I still don't claim to understand. But I believe He gave me clarity when I finally chose truth over comfort. I didn't just lose a daughter, I lost an illusion. And sometimes losing the illusion is what saves the life. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Share your thoughts below. What would you have done if you were in Thane's position facing betrayal inside your own home? I genuinely want to hear your perspective. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss future episodes. Please note, while inspired by real-world social issues, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this topic isn't aligned with your interests, feel free to explore other content that may resonate more with you.
얼만큼 넣을까? 아우 냄새. 더 넣어야 돼? 자, 한번 헹군 거 여기다 넣을게요. 맞아, 과일주니까 홍초 넣어도 맛있을 거야, 그치? 근데 깨끗하게 씻기만 하면 되잖아, 그치? 자. 썩은 거또 있잖아. 그치? 그래, 여기에 담가 놓을게요.